Welcome to episode 15 of Ask Paul Kirtley, and I'm not even outside. So welcome to episode 15. This week I've been mainly working indoors. I've been working on some writing projects and some film projects. I've been inside after being in Scotland for a month and being in Canada before that. So it's been a chance for me to catch up. I have been out and about a bit. Some of it's been raining. I've been very busy when I have been outside, so I just haven't had the time to do an episode of Ask Paul Kirtley outdoors this week. So I thought I'd invite you into my office, my study, and we could do a session here. It's very easy for me to do it. I've got the questions on my computer, and without further ado, let's go. But just in case you want to know what we're going to be talking about today, I can tell you that we're going to be talking about bushcraft in South Africa versus Scotland, bivvy bags, and some issues there, firebowls, squeaky bow drills, mix and match NCFE courses, snakes and bugs under tarps, and canoe versus kayak. And there's one other question at the end there as well, which I'll address towards the end. Okay, so first question. Okay, and this is from Leon, and Leon says, "Hi Paul, recently moved from Scotland to northern South Africa. Conditions quite different here, different flora, generally harder, yep, water less accessible, hot and arid conditions, etc. Most books and sources seem more suited to northern climates." Yeah, there's a lot of bushcraft literature around North America, northern temperate, into the boreal zone, absolutely, and Eurasia and Europe and Scandinavia. As such, any general recommendations more suitable to the southern climes, e.g. African bushveld, guessing that it would probably be similar in a lot of ways to Australian sources. Okay, excellent. So you're really questioning what sources of information you can use. Well, yes, the Australian stuff, such as it is Richard Graves' Bushcraft, although that is quite a general book, even though he was Australian, it's quite a general book, and a lot of what is in that book applies quite generally. But that's true of a lot of bushcraft skills. You know, if you're making cordage, if you're looking for tinder, it's the same sort of materials that you're looking for. You're just going to have to look for different species. The other thing I would suggest is have a look at some of the work of Les Hiddins, the Bush Tucker man. Now, clearly his focus is very much on Australian plants, but there may well be some crossover in terms of types of plants or strategies there that could be useful to you as well. And then the other thing I would say is also look at some of the literature that's aimed more at the south of the United States. So one book springs to mind, which I pulled off the shelf here, Larry Dean Olson's Outdoor Survival Skills, and he was based in more arid parts of the United States, and I think some of the stuff in there would be very relevant to southern Africa, and certainly sub-Saharan Africa generally, and certainly where you are in northern South Africa. So I hope that helps. And then of course, I mean, the other thing as well is try and get hold of some of the local guides, the field guides, both in terms of the fauna but also the flora. Because if you get some good guides, they often have a few pointers as to some of the uses as well. It depends on the author, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But generally, if you get a good guide, they'll often have, this was used by natives for whatever, or this was used by people as an indicator of water, or whatever it is. Sometimes there's those little tidbits in there as well, just in the general guide. So and there are some really good field guides for South Africa. And then the last thing I would recommend is maybe having a look at the field guide South Africa, the FGSA, who also have the tracking credentials for their bush guides. You could look into some of their training as well, because a lot of that is not just about tracking and tracks and animals, it's also about understanding the environment. So there's some useful information in that scheme as well. So all of those things, I think, combined will really start to orient you to that environment. So hopefully that's helpful, Leon. Right, next question comes from David. David Fiorini, and he says he's asking 2 questions. Okay, the first one is about rucksacks. Aside from the Carrymore 45, what other packs do you use and what are the capacities? Also, I'm a bit confused about bivvy bags. Do all bivvy bags zip to fully enclose the user? However, it doesn't look like yours closes fully. I'm a tent user and looking to try a bivvy bag. However, I think I would really prefer one that encloses fully. Okay, we'll talk about that. There are pros and cons there. Could you help me to understand exactly what these bivvy bags are? Okay, no worries, David. I will do that. So, just close that down. First question, Sabre 45. That is a rucksack that I often start with. It's quite a large pack for a day pack, but I do use it as a day pack in the winter. It's a good day pack in the mountains, and I can camp out of it in the summer in the UK. And certainly if I put side pockets on it, PLCE side pockets, I can put cooking pots and water bottles and things in one side pocket and wash kit and that type of thing, and in the other side pocket I can leave it completely free for putting food in. So if I'm going for longer, putting the side pockets on allows me to cook and eat and wash and those things that I need to do. I can get all my camping gear inside the main compartment. If you've not seen my video on how to pack all of that into that rucksack, and if you've not seen the article on what that actually contains, that's going back quite a few years now on my blog, and it's buried a long way down in the archives. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes for this, and that's over at paulkirtley.co.uk if you're listening to this on the podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube or embedded elsewhere, go over to paulkirtley.co.uk, look for the Ask Paul Kirtley shows, and then go down to the relevant episode. This is episode 15, show notes. All the links that I talk about in this show will be on that page there, all in one place. I can't put them in multiple places. I simply don't have the time to do that, unfortunately. My blog is the central hub of all that I do. Yes, there are quite a few spokes off it with podcasts and videos. I try and put the information out in the way that suits everybody, in the way that people like to consume it. I certainly like to listen to podcasts while I'm driving, for example. I rarely have time to listen to podcasts other times, so I appreciate that a lot of people like to listen to this in the car, and actually this is on iTunes now, so check it out on iTunes, and it will be on other platforms. If you want it to be on other platforms, let me know. But anyway, back to David's question. So that rucksack is the one that I use a lot of the time. In the winter, if I'm having to take more bulky sleeping bags and more kit, then I'll look at something like the Berghaus Vulcan, which is a pretty cavernous rucksack. It's a simple rucksack. It's not got lots of bells and whistles and zips and pockets and compartments. It's pretty much just a big compartment rucksack, which you can also put PLCE side pockets on. Now, I'm not specifically tied to military rucksacks or military type rucksacks. It's just that they tend to be fairly rugged. I quite like side pockets unless I'm climbing or using ropes and that type of thing. So it just helps you keep things organized. So that's something I use in the winter. And a big pack, even if you're not ramming it full, a bigger pack in the winter helps, because if your hands are cold or colder or you're using gloves, it's just harder to get everything compacted down like you can in the summer. And the other reason for that as well is that when stuff is colder, it's harder to pack down. It's not as pliable. Things become stiffer and more rigid, and everything from sleeping bags through to spare clothing and roll mats and everything just become more awkward. So having a slightly bigger pack in cold conditions, and I'm talking sort of down near zero and sub-zero temperatures, bigger sleeping bags, more clothes, more food, bigger rucksack. So Berghaus Vulcan is one that I use there. And then otherwise, I've got a couple of other rucksacks. I quite like the Crux rucksacks. I've got a Crux 47 litre rucksack, which I use as a day pack in the winter for winter mountaineering. I like that pack a lot. And then I've got the 57 litre version of the same rucksack as well, which it's a little bit small for my liking, but equally I like the fact it's a little bit small. And the reason I say that is, for example, last year, and I still haven't got this on my blog, I still haven't got a write-up of this on my blog, it's on my to-do list, but last year a couple of the guys that work with me and we went off and did a hike. It was a week-long hike in the Scottish Highlands, and the aim was to hike the Scottish 4000s, so the 9 highest mountains in Scotland, basically join them up in a continuous walk across Scotland from east to west. And that was what we did, and I used that rucksack for that trip, and that was a summer trip, but it had sleeping bags, sleeping kit, tent, spare clothes, food, stove, all of those sorts of things in that 57-litre bag, and there aren't any side pockets. And so when I say it's a bit tight, but I like the fact that it's quite hard to get everything in, it means that I cannot pack stuff just in case. It gives me a discipline where I have to really think about what I'm putting in that rucksack. So that's another rucksack that I use. In the past I used the Carrymore, what was it called? This is one of my favourite backpacking rucksacks for a long time, before rucksacks started getting lighter. It wasn't a Jaguar, it's a bit bigger than that, the Condor, Carrymore Condor. Now Carrymore SF make a similar one, but they're quite heavy now compared to some of the other rucksacks. So if you want something a bit bigger but lighter, look at Crux, look at Pod, look at Go Light. There are other rucksacks out there that are light and pretty sturdy. Those are the places that I would look. For starters, in terms of my experience, there's lots of other good rucksack manufacturers out there, but frankly, if you buy a good rucksack, they last a long time. And so I'm not reviewing rucksacks on a regular basis, and so I'm not getting sort of 10 rucksacks to try out over the course of a review period. I just buy all my own kit, all my own rucksacks I've had over the years. I've bought, nobody's given me anything or paid me to review it, any of those sorts of things. So my experience is relatively limited in terms of different models. I've tried stuff, some things I've discounted because I've tried other people's, I don't like them. I don't like Alice packs, for example. That's just personal preference. But mostly stuff I've used for a long time, and it lasts, and therefore I'll recommend it. But that means that the number of things I've used is relatively small. I'm not somebody who just goes out and buys kit for the sake of it to try the next best new thing. If it works for me, I'll use it. If I have a problem, if it doesn't quite suit the specification of a trip I'm doing, and if it's too light, if it's not tough enough, or it doesn't have the features that I need to carry the equipment that I need to carry, I'll look for a solution to that. But otherwise, that's it. So Sabre 45 with side pockets, and I've had a couple of those over the years. The Crux rucksacks 47 and 57 I like a lot, and I've liked some of the old Carrymore ones, but they're not made anymore. And the Berghaus Vulcan for a bigger winter pack. That's my answer. Right, bivvy bags. You asked about, are all bivvy bags zipped? No, they're not. Are all bivvy bags completely closed? No, they're not. The bivvy bag that I use a lot of the time is just the British military bivvy bag, which is not too heavy because it's a very simple bag. It's just a big bag. There are no zips and other things, no other attachments or places you can put poles in them. It's just a bag that goes over your sleeping bag. So it's not too heavy. It's pretty waterproof if you keep it well maintained and keep it reproofed occasionally. I just reproof mine once a year with some nick wax. That works very well. So I'm happy with that. It's tough, it's robust. I'm sleeping in woods a lot of the time that have, they've got sweet chestnut husks on them. When I'm running courses, we're down in the south of England and there's a lot of sweet chestnut coppice. I want something that's quite robust. It's not the lightest in the world, but it's also not super heavy. If you look at my Lightening the Load Part 1 video, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, I talk about a couple of different solutions there and look at how weights vary and where you can shave weight and where you need the weight, or where the weight is a trade-off for different seasons and different uses. And some bags, like the lightweight bag that I show in that video, the Snug Pack SF bivvy, it's designed to be very compact and it's got a zip up the middle. Now central zip bivvies are good in some senses in that you can sit up in them, you can zip them down, basically to your waist and sit up. That can be quite good. It's certainly good in winter conditions where you want to be getting dressed inside your bivy bag. It's easier to do that with a central zip bivy than one that comes all the way up. But the MOD one, the standard British military one, has quite a large aperture, and so you've got some leeway for moving around in it. Now, do you want things that completely close up? Generally, no, you don't, because as soon as you put your head in a bivy bag, you're breathing moisture into your sleeping kit. And while you can get away with that in a tent, you can't generally get away with it in a bivy bag, particularly if it's a bit colder, because you're just going to get a lot of condensation and a lot of moisture in your sleeping kit. That makes it damp. That means it doesn't work as well. That means you get cold. That means it needs to be dried out the next day. And if the conditions are cold, that can be difficult. So even in Arctic conditions, I will be, if I'm bivvying outside and I'm talking sort of -20s, -30s Celsius, my face is outside. Yes, I'll have a balaclava on. Yes, I'll have a hat on. Yes, I'll be using the hood of my sleeping bag, but my mouth and my nose are still outside. And if I really can't cope with the cold on my face, there's a couple of options there. One is to have something that is above your bivvy, not completely encapsulating you. So for example, in the snow, you might put snowshoes or skis and then drape a jacket over the top so the cold air is not pushing down on your face. And then the other thing you can do is take a jacket and breathe through the sleeve like an elephant. So you're breathing through the sleeve. Yes, you'll get some frost on the armpit or thereabouts on the jacket, but you're not breathing all of that moisture into your sleeping kit, and then you have to get it out, which can be impossible in sub-zero temperatures. So I've tried double hooped bivy bags where you've got two little poles and it's like a mini tent. I used to use those before you could get really good quality one-man tents. So my one-man tent weighs the same as that double hooped Gore-Tex bivy bag that I used to use years ago, and it's much more pleasant to be in the tent. I've got space for all my kit in the vestibule. I've got a much larger space to be inside. I can sit up, I can move around, I can organize myself, I can mend equipment, I can read. Whereas the little tunnel bivy bag was like getting in a little burrow. I couldn't really move around, and if you're stuck in the rain, particularly in summer conditions, you're either out in the rain or you're lying down in this thing that you can't really do anything in. Fine if you needed to move light and fast back then. I quite like bivvying in the mountains with just a bivy bag, but again, it'd be a central zip bag, and I tend to sleep with my face outside. And if it's absolutely chucking it down, if it's raining and I can't get a tarp up with walking poles or against a rock with my sleeping bag or something to cover my head, I will just put my waterproof jacket over my head and just arrange myself so that rain's not coming in. Yeah, you get a bit damp sometimes around the edges, but in the summer, not the end of the world. Bigger issue in places like Scotland are the midges in the summer. So you might want something closed up in the summer, but then again, I'll just carry a tent now for that. So if I'm in the woods, if I'm using a bivy bag, MOD bivy bag does me most of the time. If I need a super lightweight setup, I'll go to the Snugpack SF bivy, central zip. And if I'm in the winter, I use a Dutch Army bivy bag with a central zip put in, because it's bigger, I can get more kit in it, I might get bulkier sleeping bags in it, and it's also very durable. All of that is in that lightening the load video. Check that out. Hopefully that helps you, David. If you've got further questions on bivy bags, let me know. But frankly, go and get a grade 1 used surplus MOD bivy bag for about 40 quid. Go out and use it, see how you get on with it. If you don't like it, sell it to somebody else on eBay, get something else. Simple as that. You're not going to lose out very much. And at the end of the day, you can kind of theorize about this stuff. Just go and try it and see how you get on with it. Right, next question. Firebowls from Jason Edwards. Jason asks, regarding episode 8's information about where is best to have a fire, how do you rate products such as the Grilliput Fireball? Would you expect the heat to transfer through the steel and still cause problems? If the only purpose is easily discarded ashes, then I don't think it's worth the price tag. If it means less chance of spreading fire through root systems, then I think I would think about purchasing one. All right, good. Yeah, so we were talking about where to have a fire, when it's appropriate to have a fire. We mentioned fires spreading into root systems, particularly in coniferous forests where you've got shallow root systems, you've got roots going a long way close to surface, you've got loamy soil that's prone to be ignited, and particularly in dry conditions that can be a real issue. And even in not so dry conditions, you dry the ground out, you start those smouldering. So yeah, that can be an issue. And I think something that stops the fire burning down into the ground is going to help with that, definitely. So some sort of fire tray or fire stand or what have you is going to help with that. But it's still potentially going to scorch what's under it if it's lying directly on the ground, just the same as somebody going to a local park and using one of those disposable barbecues, just like a foil tray with some charcoal in and a grill over the top. The heat is such that it's going to scorch, it's going to burn and kill off the vegetation underneath. It's not going to set fire to the ground probably. It would have to be, really, 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 really hot to do that. But it's still going to damage the foliage underneath. So that's still a consideration with a lot of these firebowls and similar. They're going to get hot. They're a piece of metal, and you're having a fire in it, it will get hot. But it will stop embers spreading, it will stop ashes spreading, and it will stop fires going down into the ground. If you can get it up onto a rock, if you can get something, an air gap between what you're burning and the ground, even better, because air is a really, really good insulator. And the rate at which metal is going to conduct heat into the ground is thousands of times more than air is going to transmit it to the ground. So if you can get a bit of a gap between some metal that's got your fire on top of it and the ground, that's going to protect the ground a lot. And I wish people would do that when they're using disposable barbecues and other devices like that, and then they wouldn't be scorching grass and vegetation and what have you. As for the value of those, I don't know. I haven't used that particular model. I don't know how much they cost. I haven't researched it, so I can't comment on the value. But in principle, that could be something that's worth doing in certain circumstances to preserve the ground and to preserve the vegetation and to stop the spread of embers and ashes. So yeah, might be worth looking into. And it also depends. Some places have got a no fire rule at any time of the year, or you have to have a permit to have an uncontrolled fire, or to have an unguarded fire, or however it's phrased. But if you can pop it inside a metal container as such, then maybe you can be allowed to have a fire for cooking and boiling your water and all those sorts of things, and for warmth, when maybe you couldn't otherwise. So that's something that's worth looking into, but it's on a case-by-case basis, Jason. Right, squeaky bow drills. And this is from Ben Atten. And Ben asks, hi Paul, I'm interested in primitive fire making, and I've been experimenting with bow drill fires. Sometimes it makes horrible squeaking noise. Yeah, we've all been there, and I'm not sure why. Not only is it really annoying, it seems to vibrate the coal and not even make an ember. Have you got any advice on how to stop the squeaking noise? Is it the wood I'm using, or too much pressure, or the string? Cheers, Ben. All right, Ben. Yeah, that it's not abnormal for bow drill sets to squeak at some stage. There are various theories about why they do it. My observations are that it's often when they start to get a little bit polished, not completely polished, a little bit polished, or when the drill starts to get really dried out. So, you try and choose a drill and hearth material that is as dry as possible, yet there is still a bit of moisture in there. Anything you're pulling in, particularly if you're in the northern sort of temperate zone, you're not in really, really arid areas, or the boreal zone, there is an atmospheric moisture that permeates everything over time. And you only need to see, take a reading book out with you the next time you go camping. It will go wavy often, and that's just down to the moisture that's in the air. It's the same with your stuff that that you're collecting from the bush, and you'll test it and see if it's dry. It's the driest stuff you can find. It's not green, it's not living, it's not wet, it's dead standing. It's the driest stuff in the forest. But it will still have a little bit of moisture permeating in it. And then when you start to use that drill, you're actually, if your drill's working well, if your set's working well, you're actually exposing it to quite a lot of heat where that meeting of the drill and the hearth is. And what tends to happen, I'm sure you've noticed this, sometimes with the drill, it will start to shrink. Around the rings, and wood always shrinks more around the rings than across the rings or lengthwise along the fibers, and that's why you get cracks in big logs. If you leave a log drying, you'll start to see the cracks in the end of it, and that's because it's drying more around the rings. The same happens with your bow drill. As you start to generate some heat at the bottom, it starts to dry out more than it was to start off with, and that can cause it to crack. And that in itself, that little crack in there, can start to cause some vibrations and it starts to squeak. That's normal. So don't worry about that too much, but I think the most important thing is, how do you get beyond that? How do you make sure it works properly? And so I would say generally the time you'll often get it is you'll burn your bow drill set in, and that works well. You know, you've seated it all in, the end of your drill's black, you've got a nice black circle in the top of your hearth, you go to cut your notch, that's all good, then you start drilling, and after a little while it starts to squeak. Now, as I say, there are a couple of reasons why that might be the case. Now, if it's polished, you're on a little bit of a vicious circle there, because if it's polishing, you're probably not putting enough pressure on, maybe your wood's a bit too hard, but if you're not going to break through that sheen that you're generating, it's going to get more polished. So the immediate thing to do, if you feel like it's starting to polish, is put a little bit more pressure on. Now, if your string's not tight enough and you put more pressure on, your string will start to slip. That will put sheen on your string. If you're using paracord, for example, that will start to polish the paracord. That will grip less. So if your string starts to slip, you need to tighten it up. And once you put your drill into the string, you shouldn't be able to move it around. You shouldn't be able to slide it. If you can, the string is too slack. So check that. But provided the string is gripping the drill well enough, you should be able to put a little bit more pressure on and break through that sheen. If it's a bit more polished, then maybe what you have to do is stop, take your knife and just give it a little scrape just to break the polish on the end of the drill. Go back, and that should work a lot better. If that doesn't work, then you can start to do things like, if you can find a tiny little bit of sand or sandstone or something, put a little bit, you know, just a bit of soil that is dry but sandy, drop that in. That can work like an abrasive, and that can break up any sheen and just help the two bind together. But fundamentally, as you start to lose friction, you can get a squeak, and so you need to resolve that quite quickly, because you get into a vicious circle where it becomes more polished either at the drill or at the string, and you need to sort that out. And there are a few suggestions as to how to do that there. If it's just because the end of the drill is cracked, you just kind of have to live with that. In terms of the noise, it can be really piercing and unpleasant on your ear. The more important point, as you've said, is that it can vibrate the dust around and can stop a coal from forming, and that's very true. So what you need to do is make sure that your hearthboard is on as solid a footing as possible. Now, if it's too hard, then you know, if you were to bow drill on top of a piece of rock, it would be quite hard to keep it still. Whereas if you're on a slightly softer surface, it will just slightly bed in. You know, if you do it on the earth or dirt, it's going to bed in. It's not going to move around so much. That the two are going to form together very nicely, and that will stay still. And at the end of the day, the hearth could be moving around if you're not putting enough weight on it. And so again, putting pressure on the drill, that comes from body weight. It doesn't come from pushing away with your arm. And so you want to keep your hands clamped to your shin, and then just put a bit of more weight towards your front leg, the one that's sat on top of the hearthboard. And as you do so, that should also help secure it in place. And if it's still moving around, maybe you then need to stop and find a better spot where the hearth isn't moving around. If it's vibrating too much, then you need to do something to solve that. Also, if there's a bit of a gap between what you're collecting the ember on, what you're collecting the dust on, and the hearthboard, so that the bottom of your hearthboard might not be that flat, and if there's a gap, that means the two can be moving relative to each other, and again that will disturb the dust that you're creating. So better still, have the hearth, pushing down on what you're collecting, whether that's a piece of bark or a piece of wood or a piece of wood shavings, whatever you're collecting your dust on, have that really well connected to the hearth, and have the hearth really well connected to the ground, and then nothing can move around relative to each other. So that's a thing to look at, and that should really do you. Those solutions should help you get to where you need to be, Ben. And if it squeaks a little bit after you've sorted all of those things, then just work through it. I would put a bit more pressure on, a bit more force. Remember to use full length of the string. Get really good bow strokes. Keep it nice and parallel to the ground, and you should work through that squeak, and as the temperature changes it should stop doing it. So hopefully that helps, Ben. Go and try those things, go and troubleshoot your set and see if it works. Let me know how you get on. I'm interested to see. And if you do have specific problems, come back, let me know what materials you're using, what species of wood, diameters, maybe send me some photos, and we can go from there. Okay, mix and match NCFE courses. For those not familiar, NCFEs, Northern Counties, it's a board that sets exams. Well, actually, it used to set exams. They now kind of ratify a process for an examination. Now, the only NCFE exam I've ever done is back at school many years ago, when the information technology and computer course that I was doing, and I'm going back a long way here, back when I was sort of 14, they had us learn to type on a typewriter first, and an electric typewriter, before we were allowed on a word processor. And the NCFE certificate that I did was a typing certificate. So the only NCFE certificate that I've got is for typing. And to be honest with you, that's extremely useful. I write a lot of articles for magazines and for my blog, and I can type pretty fast. So that's actually been a very valuable thing for me to learn in terms of sharing my bushcraft knowledge. So not all wasted. But what we're talking about here is not typing exams. We're talking about, there are a few providers who provide bushcraft training and bushcraft leadership training. It's aimed at people that want to teach at various different levels, and it goes from it just being a short weekend course. So for level 2, for example, there's level 3, which is a bit more involved, and then level 4 typically involves nearly a year of study, sort of minimum, to get that level 4. And John Ryder was the guy who really instigated this, and he was originally working with Plumpton College, but he now just offers them himself through the Woodcraft School. And I know some people who've been through it and they say very good things about it, and I know John, and he's a good guy, he's got a lot of integrity, so that's a good course to get on, and you learn some good stuff from that. In my experience, having hired a few people or interviewed a few people and hired at least one person that has done that course, there's still a lot to learn about running bushcraft courses once you've got that foundation in place. And you know, typically the people who, and I'm not dismissing that at all, it's just that, you know, it's like any job that you do, you go and do some training and then you really start learning. You know, whether you're a lawyer or a doctor or any of these things, you know, you do your kind of baseline training, but then there's a lot of learning that goes on top of that. And, you know, same for me, you know, I apprenticed with Mears, and once you start assisting, and then you're a senior assistant, and then you're running courses, your learning curve is super steep. So, you know, let's just caveat all of these things is that, you know, none of these courses are going to take you from zero to hero in one fell swoop, but they're a great foundational plank for people that need that, and it's a great way to learn, and it's a great way to be with a bunch of other people who are all similarly motivated as well on those courses. So so the question here about these courses sort of went off on a bit of a sidetrack there, but basically, yes, they are worth doing, and that I know that wasn't the question, but just for people that don't know about these schemes. Now, there are a few other people other than John that offer courses that have been ratified by the NCFE, and that doesn't really tell you much about the quality of the bushcraft or survival skills that are being taught, or even really about the train the trainer stuff that's been taught in terms of teaching you how to teach. It just shows that certain hoops have been jumped through. And frankly, I think there are varying different qualities out there. So should you mix and match? It depends. If you're getting on well within the establishment or with the instructor that you're currently training with and you're happy with that, then stick with it. You know, when I've been going, since I started to learn to canoe about a decade ago, where I really seriously got into it rather than just sort of playing around occasionally, my instructor pretty much the whole time has been Ray Goodwin. Now I go to events and symposiums and things where you go out with other people that have got more experience, but largely I've trained with Ray, I've worked with Ray, and it's only when I've done assessments, just to avoid a conflict of interest, I've gone to other people. But there is value in, you know, sticking with somebody that works for you. If it works, then great. But equally, at some point, it's worth going and learning with other people, because they have a different perspective, they have a different way of explaining things, they have a different starting point, they have a different motivation for what they're doing, and they have different experiences, and that's valuable. That just creates a thicker, more dense, more complicated mat and web of experience and advice for you, and that can be extremely helpful. So if you feel like you need that, then by all means move around. And also, don't be afraid to go and learn from people that are teaching courses that aren't ratified with NCFE overlays, because you're going to learn stuff from that as well. And so I would just really look at what you think you need to learn. If you're not happy with where you're learning, then look around. If you are happy, stick with that as the core, and then maybe augment it as and when you feel that's necessary. And it's the same with any learning. I think you just have to go with your intuition about what you need and be honest with yourself, and then go from there. But if the question is, are people going to look more fondly and look more favorably on somebody who's jumped around versus somebody who's done training with the same provider? I don't think it makes any difference, frankly. It certainly doesn't to me. Okay, Sam, hopefully that helps. Couple more, going to have to be quite quick on these. Snakes and bugs under tarps, and this is from Dan. And Dan says, hi Paul, sleeping under a tarp when in the woods seems great, but isn't there a risk of snakes or bugs or something? If so, how do you protect yourself? Cheers, Dan. Well, I've talked quite a bit about tarps and bivvies and hammocks and tents in previous episodes. Go and check those out, Dan. Go and check those out, anybody else that's wondering about this. But fundamentally, in some parts of the world, yes, bugs and snakes and other things can potentially be an issue. You know, so if you're sleeping in tropical areas, if you're sleeping in areas where there are dangerous snakes, if you're sleeping in areas where there are problematic insects, then you'd be better off in a hammock. That's what hammocks are for, largely. So if you want to sleep under a tarp, but you don't want to sleep on the ground, sleep in a hammock. Now, in the UK, am I bothered about sleeping on the ground? No. In Europe, am I bothered about sleeping on the ground? No. You know, when I go to Africa, I'd rather be in a tent. When I go to, you know, and it can be quite an open canvas sort of tent, but, you know, I don't want to be out in the open, and that's not just about snakes. It's also about other things that are around in the bush. In more tropical areas, I want to be in a hammock. It's that simple. So I'm not dogmatic about this. It's just that I quite like sleeping on a flat, hard piece of ground. It's best for my back. It's simple. You can throw that setup very quickly. I can throw my setup very quickly. I'm happy with it. But then when I go to places where I need to be off the ground, then I do that. And that's my view, Dan. So hopefully that makes sense. Canoe versus kayak, and this is a question from Anton Erdman, and he asks, well, first of all, he says, thanks for the great show. You're very welcome, Anton. Thank you for the kind words. He says, I really enjoy it. Could you please share your thoughts about canoe versus kayaks? Seemingly you have great experience with both. Do you prefer one over the other, or does it depend on a route you are taking? Thanks in advance. Regards, Anton. Well, first off, let me be clear. I have a lot more experience in canoes than I do in kayaks. I've got very little experience in kayaks. Most of my water travel has been in a canoe, and by a canoe, just for the sake of clarity, I mean what some people will call a Canadian canoe, an open canoe, 15 or 16 or 17 foot long with an open top that you can get quite a lot of equipment in, or a couple of people in there. That to me has been a watercraft of choice partly because of the places that I'm going. I've done trips in Canada in exactly the place that the canoe was designed for. The canoe was born in that environment. It makes perfect sense in there. There's a lot of water, both in terms of rivers and lakes and tributaries, and getting through that environment is virtually impossible without some sort of watercraft. And so the canoe makes sense there. The design that we use now is fundamentally the same as the old birch bark canoes, and they were designed to both be portable out of the water, to work well in the water, and to be able to carry a load. And so for me, most of the time, that makes perfect sense in terms of the journeys that I want to make, whether they're in Canada, whether they're in that same sort of mode of transport on rivers and on lakes, inland. That to me makes sense, and that's what I've done, and that's why I choose to travel that way, because they're designed for that. In modern river kayaks are designed largely for more extreme white water paddling, and that's absolutely fine. It's a great recreational thing to do, but they're not really designed, particularly the shorter play boats, they're not designed for journeying, and they're not designed for touring, and they're not designed to have a lot of equipment in there. Now, some people do make trips where they put some equipment in, and that's fine, but I think in terms of comfort, for most people, unless you're paddling some really extreme water, sort of above grade 3 or class 3, depending on where you live in the world, most of the time you're going to be fine in a canoe. And only when you get out onto the sea or very large bodies of inland water, so we're talking the Great Lakes in Canada, for example, or out onto open water around the UK, around the coast of the UK, then sea kayaks start to come into their own there. And certainly, it's something that I aspire to do but haven't done. There are some fantastic journeys to be done in the islands, for example, or off Scotland, and certainly in other parts of the world as well. There are some fantastic sea kayaking journeys to do. They're bigger boats, you can put more equipment in them. If you want to know what that sort of journey looks like, although it might put you off a little bit, have a look at or have a listen to the podcast I did with Justine Kergenven, who sea kayaked the Aleutian Islands with Sarah Uten, and she just recently finished her round the world trip, Sarah Uten, so that's been in the news recently. But go back and listen to my podcast with her about that journey. That's very interesting. That's a sea kayak journey. And so to me, the two craft that really appeal are the canoe and the sea kayak. I'm not so much of a white water junkie that I want to be paddling hard on rivers in river kayaks, but that's just me. I take my hats off to the guys who do, and if you want to watch the most extreme version of that, have a look at the Great Inga project, which a friend of mine, Malcolm, recommended, and it's about some guys paddling these humongous rapids on the Congo River. Incredible to watch. I watched it on Netflix, I think, but you can find it on YouTube and various other places as well, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes if I remember to as well. So hopefully that answers your question, Anton. And just if you can find a club, go and try both if you can, or maybe a store that sells both, and ask if they've got water nearby you can try, or friends that have got one or the other. Go and try them, see what you like doing, and go from there. And they're not mutually exclusive. I know plenty of people who they river kayak, they sea kayak, and they open boat as well. They just choose the craft that suits them for the particular activity. But most of the time, for touring and traveling inland, canoe, offshore, on the sea, large bodies of inland water like Lake Superior or something, sea kayaks work very well, and river kayaks if you really want to go for it with the white water. Dun, 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 dun. So last question is from Adrian Spring, and I think it's Adrian's aspiration to try and get a question on every single episode of Ask Paul Kirtley. I do appreciate you asking the questions, though, Adrian. I'm not taking the mickey. And I actually like this question as well, particularly because he's asking what he can give back. He appreciates the fact, and he says, "Hi Paul, had a moment of clarity. Further to Ask Paul Kirtley, episode 10, you do so much for us, there must be something that we can do for you to help you in some way. Please feel free to ask. All the best, Adrian." Well, that's very kind of you, Adrian. I don't make these shows to expect in the expectation that I get something back, although really I just want people to watch them and hopefully they benefit them, and that for me is the benefit. I do like people to let me know, but that's not expected. It's just nice when they do, that they find it useful. And as I asked a few episodes ago for the lurkers to say hello, and it was fantastic, all these people came out the woodwork and said hello on YouTube comments and on blog comments, and that was great, so thank you for that. What you can do for me, is if you like a particular show, the thing I would ask is that other people are probably going to like it too. Other people like you will appreciate the particular Q&A session that you've just liked, you've just enjoyed and got value from. So if you could just share it with a Facebook group or an online community that you're part of, so that they get the benefit too. I'm not gonna try and hide that benefits me as well. It grows my audience, but also it benefits those people, and we become a bigger and smarter and more well-informed community as a result of that, and we increase the debate. And it's the same if you consume this via audio. As I said before, it's now on iTunes. If you don't already subscribe on iTunes, if you're an iTunes user, as a lot of people are, then you can go over to iTunes and subscribe. That will help me out a lot. You can leave a rating or a ranking there on iTunes, or both, and that will help me a lot as well, because it just makes it more visible. The engine within iTunes will make it visible to more people who like related, so outdoor and that type of podcast. It will put it in front of them more often, and that will mean that I'll potentially grow the audience there on iTunes as well, which is helpful for the same reasons I've just talked about. So if you can share, if you can like, if you can leave a little rating on iTunes, and also if you don't use iTunes, anybody that uses an iOS device, an Apple device, there's an app, there's a podcast app now, where you can get podcasts. So if you don't like iTunes but you have the podcast app, you can subscribe that way. And there's a feed on my blog as well now. So if you've got some sort of app that pulls RSS feeds in directly, the feed is there on my blog, and you can pull it in that way. And if you want to see it on other platforms, let me know. So yeah, if you can do anything to help Adrian and other people that want to help, is just share the stuff that you enjoy that I put out with the wider community, so that they get the benefit too. I grow my audience, I get more questions as well. The bigger the audience, the more questions I get. And hopefully I get some that haven't been asked before, and again, that can help inform you. That will be beneficial to you if I'm answering questions that maybe you hadn't thought of, or coming at things from a different perspective. So that everybody wins that way. So that's my main thing really, Adrian. So thanks for asking the question. Thanks for watching this episode of Ask Paul Kirtley from my office, and hopefully you haven't been too distracted by the bookcase behind me to try and see what all the books are. Probably can't see them on the screen, it's too small. Yeah, I will hope to be back outside again on the next episode of Ask Paul Kirtley. And it did amuse me when I first started, pressed the recording button. I thought, well, I'm in effectively in a bedroom, and it's probably quite apt for a mid-teenager. We're at 15 now, 15 episodes in, 15 teenager probably doesn't go outside very much. That's what adults say anyway. Teenagers stay inside all the time. Yeah, I thought that was quite amusing. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. I'll stop waffling, and I'll see you on the next episode of Ask Paul Kirtley. Cheers.